Great. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Mariana Islam. I'm the Director of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, where we accelerate advocacy and community-led change by supporting local, statewide, and national campaigns to close the opportunity gaps that far too many of our students experience across the United States. In the last year, we have learned a lot about what we can and should do to build state accountability plans for equity and opportunity. We also learn more about what other states are doing that can help guide us in our work. So we are excited to provide this extended 90-minute learning opportunity with an expert panel of leaders and education justice advocates for this discussion to help guide those of us who are immersed in this work, really struggling with building plans in our respective states, including those of us who are parents, student advocates, educators, administrators, to those of you who are on state boards of education and part of the larger philanthropic community. Before we get started, I want to cover a few important logistics. A link to this presentation, as well as links to resources referenced on this webinar, will be posted in the chat box and available at our website, schottfoundation.org. To help facilitate your engagement throughout this webinar, please use the chat feature to post your questions. We also encourage you to tweet your thoughts and questions to our Twitter handle @SchottFound using the hashtag GrassrootsEd. We will use some time during the end of the webinar to respond to your questions. Lastly, this webinar will be made available via our YouTube page and website. So I'm delighted to be joined by our moderator for today's discussion, Tanya Clayhouse, who has been working with the Schott Foundation to help us continue to lift up equity as a priority in our work. Tanya is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for P-12 Education at the U.S. Department of Education. Before this, she served as the Director of the Public Policy Department at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She formerly served as the Public Policy Director at the People for the American Way, and as the policy liaison for the African American Ministers Leadership Council. She has previously worked for Texas State Rep Sheila Jackson Lee and California State Senator Barbara Boxer and the Kentucky Department of Education. Tanya is also a member of the Board of Directors of the National Bar Association and chair of the Civil Rights Law section. Among many other things, the Root.com named her one of the top 100 African Americans to watch for 2010. And she was also awarded the 2003 Congressional Black Caucus Chairs Award. I am delighted to welcome Tanya.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me, or is there feedback? It sounds like there's feedback. If we could make sure that people, if they have their lines muted, that would be particularly helpful. I think that we've worked that out. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here to speak with everybody today. As Mariana indicated, I have been working with the Schott Foundation in order to help identify ways in which all of you all can be most impactful in the work that you're doing in order to, as the states and your districts are creating these state plans under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it is something that I think all of us have to be particularly concerned about and engaged in, because it is so fundamental to the things that we care about, particularly our children. I think, as we know, that this process can seem particularly overwhelming. And this is one of the reasons why we're hosting this webinar today. Our goal is essentially to assist stakeholders like yourself in your efforts to be effective advocates in this entire process. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give you an initial overview of some of the things that we're going to cover during this webinar. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague at the Education Justice Network, Beth Glenn, who is then going to take it from there and discuss some additional issues, particularly regarding the budget and the impact on and the use of school improvement plans. She will then hand it over to Jamie Koppel with the Communities for Just Schools, who will talk particularly about some of the transparency issues engaged with, that you should be concerned about as stakeholders, how you engage in consultation in this entire process, and why this data transparency is particularly important. And also that she will discuss the initiative that Communities for Just Schools and a lot of our networks have been engaged in order to support this work on ESSA. And lastly, Jamie will then hand it over to Marilyn Young, who is representing Southern Echo and one of our wonderful grantees from the Schott Foundation and from others that has been particularly engaged in this entire ESSA process. I will then wrap it up and to talk a little bit more about some additional ways in which you can engage with your state and with your districts to ensure equity and accountability beyond just the ESSA state planning process. And then we're going to leave it open for questions, and we hope to be able to have a good amount of time to answer your questions and do a bit more in-depthly so that we can make sure that you are provided the necessary tools after this webinar. And so with that, I'm going to move forward, as I said, to our first slide, which essentially is an overview is an encapsulation of an infographic that was created in coordination with Southern Echo and the Schott Foundation in order to greatly, or to simplify in certain ways, the ability of the process of Every Student Succeeds Act and how it is, and the timelines, the process, and the particular issues that you should be engaged in. This does serve as, I think, a good overview. I think in this first slide, it essentially talks about what ESSA is. I think we all are very much aware of how this came to fruition with the reauthorization after the No Child Left Behind Act. It took over a decade to finally reauthorize, but we did it. And it was something that, while may not have been the favorite and the best result for, I think, everybody who was engaged in this process, there are opportunities there to ensure that we can still provide equity and make sure that we have the appropriate amount of oversight by the federal government to protect particularly our students of color. Next, in this slide, you'll see, again, as part of the infographic, it just talks about the deadlines. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. The last deadline that is coming up is September 18th, 2017. And again, this is really something that most of you are probably going to be make sure that is present in your mind, because as of right now, only 17 states have actually submitted plans under ESSA. At this point, where the infographic does talk about what goes into accountability plans and the types of factors that should be considered within this plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, particularly those issues that will ensure appropriate amount of equity consideration within the plans. But this is just an outlining of the types of indicators that can be considered by the plans. Proficiency in reading and math, graduation rates, student growth, English language proficiency, and definitely school quality, which then encompasses a number of things as outlined in this infographic. And then lastly, there's also the importance of, once you've identified those schools that are lowest performing, those subgroups of students that are low performing, there's a need to create school improvement plans. As I indicated earlier, my colleague Beth will talk a little bit more in depth about what goes into this process. So let me move to kind of the beginning of some of the substance of the webinar. And I always like to start this process out as we talk about before we get into the technical aspects within ESSA, I like to put this in context. Education is a civil right, and I know that we believe that not only at the Schott Foundation, but all within all the organizations that are presenting this today. Education is a civil right. The Elementary Secondary Education Act was created as a civil rights law during the Civil Rights Movement in 1965. And this is something that I think needs to be put in context as we talk about the ESSA. Because while there are changes that have been created as a result of this reauthorization, while there are definitely some limiting factors that have been put in place that are different from the original bill that do provide essentially more discretion and more flexibility for states and districts, and some lessening of the ability or the lessening of the authority in some regard of the federal government. It does not mean that federal authority does not exist. And so I think that is why it is extremely important for people to understand the context of this, that all the issues that we're talking about today are really in the context of ensuring and protecting the rights of all of our students, particularly those that are most vulnerable and disadvantaged, and making sure that they have the requisite opportunity to learn. And so, as I indicated, there are some critical deadlines that we want to make sure are considered. The first deadline has passed, April 3rd, 2017, and there were 17 states that submitted plans already. Those states include the District of Columbia, Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Maine, Michigan, North Dakota, New Jersey, New Mexico, Nevada, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont. Now, if your state was not listed, and if I did not list your state, then that means that you are still in the running to, there are still opportunities to engage, at least in the initial creation of these plans. There continues to be opportunities to engage, and we will discuss that, even if your state has submitted its plan, and even if it has been approved, which they all have been approved by the Department of Education. So that is the initial deadline. There are additional deadlines that are coming up. Particularly important are the identification of comprehensive and targeted support schools. That must be done for the 2018-19 school year. And furthermore, there is a deadline of the reporting. That's the transparency that we were talking about is so important to understand what is happening in our schools. And that deadline is December 31st, 2018, and that will report on what's happening in the 2017 and 18 school year. So as we get into more of the substance of this webinar, I want to highlight some of the critical focal points of this conversation here today. When we discuss how we want to ensure equality of opportunity for all students, one of the first questions we must ask is, what does that mean? What does equity mean? And I think that equity looks like it looks like a comprehensive strategic plan that really ensures that we are considering all components of accountability. And that necessarily means the components of resources, of course, and not just financial resources, but resources that include the workforce, for example, ensuring that you have quality teachers and access to quality teachers within all schools, ensuring that you have the necessary coursework, ability to access gifted and talented programs, advanced placement programs, access to school counselors, access to technology, and additional focal points in equity. It means that you also have the transparency of information so that you know what's happening in your schools. And so these are some of the key areas that we're going to be focused on today. And I want us to first start out with this issue of how it is that we ensure that there's equity through these state plans. I think one of the things that I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that, one of the things that I think oftentimes is a misperception in this process and the creation of the equity plans is that there is a need, that there is a requirement that actually be consolidated. And that is actually not a requirement. In fact, there is still an ability of states to turn in separate plans for Title I, for Title II, Title III, so on. And we wanted to emphasize within this webinar that the rationale behind trying to ensure that there's a consolidation of all these plans is that so that we can have this type of comprehensive strategy that is put in place that does ensure equity, as I just discussed. It discusses all the components that go into the distribution of resources through all the titles, as well as the application of services, for example, through Title IV, the distribution of teachers in Title II, and so on and so on. And so that is why it is extremely important as we talk about these issues and we talk about the state plans, that yes, we talk about the need for consolidated state plans, but I think that I want to make sure that people understand why it's critically important to really push your states to make sure that that is something that they are engaged in, that is the process they are engaged in. Through this planning process, as I indicated, we should be considering how it is that states are effectively utilizing the additional titles within ESSA to most effectively impact students within their districts, and to help eliminate the achievement gaps and provide that opportunity to learn. One of those ways that is important to consider, one of those areas that's important to consider, is the use of your Title II funds. There is a requirement within Title II that districts have to identify, in particular, how it is that they are going to, whether or not there is a, let me make sure that I have the right language in here. I'll get to that later. They have to make sure that they are identifying whether or not there's a disproportionate number of ineffective, and I'm sorry if I misplaced the exact quote, but ineffective and teachers, inexperienced teachers within schools that have a high proportion of low income and minority students. And one of the ways in doing that is we want to ensure that there's a consideration of how to eliminate these disparities if that identification, and if there is a disproportionate number of teachers that are within that category that are teaching low income and minority children. And so it is something that I think all states should definitely consider. If they are in receipt of these Title II funds, there is an opportunity for states to require that districts actually describe how they're going to provide such students with greater access to effective teachers. There are ways in which a state can also ensure that it is diversifying the workforce as a way to eliminate this achievement gap, because we know through a variety of research that has come out in the past, even more recently, that there is a difference of expectations that does ensue, particularly from amongst students of color, Black boys and girls in particular, when you have more diverse workforce. And so there is an ability for within the state plans to consider these efforts as you're creating your state plans, and then ultimately creating your improvement plans that we'll talk about later. Additionally, as these consolidated state plans are being created, there should be a consideration of the use of Title IV funds. Title IV has essentially been developed into a block grant in which states can allocate a certain amount of money, the federal government will allocate a certain amount of money to states in order to provide for a variety of different services. And it's essentially kind of a mishmash of a number of things that can be utilized within that can be done within Title IV. Different things such as promoting community and parent involvement in schools, as indicated in this slide, as well as supportive school climates, mental health services, kind of dealing with the reduction of exclusionary discipline policies, promoting access to advanced placement programs, as well as nutrition and physical education courses, and implementing systems that prevent bullying and harassment. This is an opportunity to ensure that all students have access to what we call a holistic, well-rounded education, which is particularly central to, I think, the shared work across programs in ESSA, something that I know within the department, when I was a part of the Department of Education with former Secretary John King, that was heavily emphasized, that is need to ensure that the whole child is taken care of. And that necessarily means that we should consider how it is that we are providing services, particularly for those students who have other challenges that they are facing that are limiting their opportunity to learn and their ability to be as successful in the classroom as they can. So here, I want to actually skip to this next slide and then come back to the questions. Just kind of talk briefly about how it is that we can, beyond the consolidated state plans, even looking particularly within the accountability requirements, looking at the indicators. I think something that was mentioned earlier, that there are ways to, you want to ask the appropriate questions and figure out how it is that your states are incorporating indicators that are going to appropriately assess what is happening within your schools and for all students within the schools. They have to consider the graduation rates for high school and in high schools. Within elementary and middle schools, there must be a consideration of student growth or other indicators that meaningfully differentiate school performance. They must consider proficiency as well as English language proficiency. And then this area of school quality. And that is something that has been pulled out by in different ways to address these concerns about chronic absenteeism. You could, as an opportunity to consider, again, the impact of discipline procedures within the classroom and how that's impacting the environment. These are a couple of ways in which we can more effectively assess what's happening in schools, and this will particularly have an impact upon schools that tend to have a higher proportion of students of color and low-income students, because we know from research that there does tend to be a disproportionate impact of discipline procedures upon students of color. And so we want to make sure that we are not simply throwing by the wayside those factors that are contributing to their inability to be as effective in the classroom. And so these are the types of things that we want you to make sure that you're looking out for within your state plans, whether they've been created or still in development, and if and asking the appropriate questions. So in understanding how it is that your state came to identify which indicators they're going to be using in order to fully hold accountable the schools and how they're helping all of our students in the classroom. And so now I want to go back to these questions, and this is kind of the leave behind before I turn it over to Beth. And leave behind is that these are the questions that kind of encapsulate all of the issues that I've previously discussed, particularly about the need to have a consolidated state plan, and I'll also get to questions about, what kind of indicators you want to incorporate into your accountability plan. And this sums up, number one, is the state submitting a consolidated state plan? If not, ask why. What was their decision-making process behind this? And secondly, is there a state process for consultation before this is finally submitted to the U.S. Department of Education, and opportunity for feedback? And there's some sub-questions within that you can ask about proper monitoring, how they're going to ensure that, as well as a timeline for addressing and providing certain corrective actions. We talked about the use of Title II funds, and this goes to outlining how the district is going to ensure that as minority and low-income students are not taught at a disproportionate rate by ineffective out-of-field and inexperienced teachers. And then other questions include how the state is working with the parents and communities, and how they're ensuring that there's a recruitment and retention of effective and diverse teacher workforce. I talked about Title IV, and particularly, I think a question that should be asked is how they're incorporating these funds to assist justice-involved youth. And then lastly, how they're incorporating the use of Title funds to ensure students are receiving a well-rounded education. And then the additional questions leave behind for the accountability requirements are here as well. We already talked about how they're incorporating the school quality indicator within to their plan, and as well as how the plan is actually identifying, not simply using money to address this issue of disproportionality of ineffective, out-of-field, and inexperienced teachers, but actually how they're identifying and what is the process by which they're utilizing this requirement and making sure that it is truly effective within their plan. And then again, the process for providing corrective action. So throughout this webinar, you will see these types of questions that are going to be asked. I think that is an appropriate way for you to really focus on how it is you should engage your states and your districts and the questions that you should be asking, even as you're understanding the entire context of ESSA implementation. This is a quick and dirty way, if I could say it that way, to just kind of make sure that you are being that effective advocate and asking the right questions, and so that they know that you are going to be watching how it is that they're engaged, that the state and the districts are engaging in the implementation of ESSA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Beth Glenn, who is going to continue on another segment of this presentation. Beth.
Let's see. All right, can everybody hear me? Thank you.
And Beth, I'm sorry, Beth, just let me know when you need me to change the slide and I'll do so.
Got it, can do. Thank you, Tanya. I get the privilege of talking to you all a little bit about how schools are going to be selected for improvement and how they can be turned around, including what some of the budget and monetary aspects of that process are. So by the start of the school year in 2018, your states and districts are going to come up with a list. And these are schools that are in the lowest 5% according to test scores, high schools that graduate less than 2/3 of their students, and schools with consistently low performing subgroups. And when we talk about subgroups, we mean students who are English language learners, those who qualify for free and reduced lunch, who are typically, underserved by schools. And so Title I was really designed to help these students who are generally disadvantaged and to give an extra federal boost to the education of those students. And so several of the questions that are flagged at the end of this section that you'll see that you should ask is how they're structured around what it takes to be a consistently low performing school. So for instance, how many years are you counting that the school has been low performing? Do those years have to be consecutive, in order? When does the clock actually start on a low performing school? Are they going to consider years that are before 2017-18 when this ESSA fully actually becomes implemented? And when do schools come off the list? You'll also notice on the slide that you can identify the schools that are in need of assistance every 3 years, or you could do it as regularly as annually. And this is another area to really watch carefully. It can be a good thing if states and districts are directing extra resources to these schools, but it can also be an attempt to kind of overwhelm the system if you're adding more and more schools every year and not really supporting them, or if schools cycle on and off and don't receive consistent support. So one of the things that we found in research is for schools to change, it usually takes about 5 years. And so ideally you would want to advocate for a process where schools get 5 good years of consistent support in order to improve and to turn around under ESSA. So next slide, please. Okay, so, nope, go back one. Yep. So ensuring equity through school improvement funds and plans. So Title I is really the big enchilada, as we were saying, for struggling schools and schools that serve disadvantaged students. And so states are going to have to allocate at least 95% of their Title I funds that they get from the federal government to districts to support these identified schools that we talked about that are going to go on this list. States have to prioritize school districts that use the funds for those schools on the list. that show the greatest need for funds and that show the strongest commitment to using those funds to improve achievement and outcomes. So again, when states are deciding how they're going to push this money down to districts, they should also consider the districts that are struggling the most, right? Or with the most schools that are identified on the list. Those are the districts that should get the most. And you can partner with your district to appeal to state leaders if that's not the case, if that's not how it's shaking out in your state. But conversely, states can then partner with communities to make sure districts live up to their end of the bargain, right? They should be held to the same principle in that they should direct the most money to the schools that are showing the greatest need. And so a district, when it's making those decisions about where the money goes, its plan has to describe how it's going to support identified schools and how it's going to monitor improvement in the schools that are receiving those Title I funds. So you'll see the targeted and comprehensive improvement plans have to be developed at the district level. Now we've moved from the state to what districts are going to do to turn schools around. And they should consult with principals, teachers, and parents. They should be based on evidence. So there should be studies saying that this has worked in other places that are similar to the environment that your district is facing. And it should focus on all the indicators in the low performing subgroups that made the school make the list to start with. Then finally, they should focus on resource inequities. And that's a particularly important part of this, the next part of this discussion. If we could go to the next slide. All right, so the first thing to note is that all the schools that are identified on the list should conduct something called an equity assessment. And that should really look at the strengths and the needs of the individual schools that have been identified as struggling. Now, this phrase equity assessments isn't really well defined in ESSA, so that's really an opportunity for activists to set the terms of the debate. And if you can do so with the end in mind, for instance, if you know that from talking to students, from talking to parents, or hearing from teachers, that school climate or attendance is a problem at a particular school, then you can look at the data when you do the equity assessment around discipline, around whether there are counselors there, around the sorts of courses that are offered and extracurriculars, because we know that these are all things that keep students connected to school. And these are things that can raise attendance and reduce discipline incidents. So the turnaround plan should be responsive to these equity assessments, but that takes money. Right? So some of that money can be found in Title I, and states can set aside up to 7% of their Title I funds for school improvement. And that's an increase of 4% under No Child Left Behind that was set aside for school improvement. And then a further 3% has been set aside under ESSA in Title I to allow for direct student services. And those are things like advanced placement, international baccalaureate, advanced coursework at the middle and elementary school level, so gifted and talented type classes, career technical education, and personalized learning. So all of those things are things that can count under direct student services under Title I, and there's money specifically set aside just to spend on that. So there's also opportunities to fund school turnaround in Title II. So as Tanya was saying before, if your school has teachers that are out of field, if it has a shortage of teachers, or if it lacks diverse teachers, funds to change those conditions can be found in Title II. And then finally, more funds are available and specifically set aside for turnaround elements in Title IV of ESSA. And that's set out so that districts receiving at least $30,000 have to spend at least 20% of their Title IV funds on at least one activity that helps a student become well-rounded. And then they have to spend another 20% of their Title IV funds on one activity that helps students be safe and healthy. So it's important to ask how your state's engaging around turnaround. For instance, do districts have to apply? Is it a competitive process or a lobbying process? Is there an approved list of programs that districts can use? How are they helping districts who may be too under-resourced to fund something like International Baccalaureate on their own, or fund things like extended learning opportunities or restorative justice or community school coordinators? All these are important questions to ask when you're thinking about how your district is going to divide up this money that's coming through Title I, Title II, and Title IV to improve schools. All right, next slide. So again, this is just a summary of the questions as you're thinking about how plans are developed and how funds are allocated to turn around schools. How long must a subgroup be consistently underperforming? Will the state be providing services directly to the schools and bypassing the district? Or how do those relationships work? How has the state decided to allocate school improvement funds? You know, these are really areas of the law that are a little fuzzy and are undefined. And so that's an area that districts might make mischief unless advocates are careful about asking questions there. So next slide, please. So a parallel process, the way that ESSA actually gets enacted is through the federal budget. They have to allocate the money to put any of these laws and policies into place. And there are a number of threats, unfortunately, to equity in the proposed administration's budget. The administration has proposed cutting $9.2 billion, or about 13.5%, from the education budget, and it's really going to most negatively impact the poor and the people who are seeking to join the middle class. It's a bait and switch plan, the way that it's been laid out so far, because it cuts from programs that fund traditional schools and then gives you money if you use that those funds for vouchers, which can go to private or religious schools. And to keep in mind as we talk about the detailed elements of the budget, really the biggest threats are not in enactment as it is, exactly as it came from the White House, but that they'll make smaller cuts that are still just as damaging, but they seem reasonable by comparison because they're not as big as what the administration proposed initially. So again, Title I is where $240 million has been set aside for a voucher pilot program, and it's being taken from. This could also be worse, though, if portability is enacted. There's a net cut to Title I already, and money already follows the child under Title I in the public system. But if states opt into this $1.4 billion funding pot where federal money can follow the child to private and religious schools through vouchers, then that's going to drain even more money from public schools. And then there's going to be, they've proposed eliminating Title II completely. So no supports for teaching. That's teachers that reduce class sizes. If professional learning is needed to help younger teachers get better or help veteran teachers become culturally competent, there'll be no funds for that. There are no funds for time to perfect your lessons or attract specialists in shortage areas like English language learning, teachers who can help special needs students, and advanced science and math teachers. So if the budget is enacted the way the administration proposed, there'll be no funds for any of those things. And then finally, there's the chance of transfer from and within Title IV that might negate some of those set-asides we talked about in the last slide. So if they transfer, remember only 10% was set aside, so they could transfer the other 90% of money in Title IV up into Title I, and they could use that for the voucher program. Or they could transfer within Title IV. And remember, that's where we used to get money for restorative justice and school social workers and community school coordinators. And if that money stays in Title IV, it could be used for technology instead of any of those things, because we removed any kind of set-asides for 21st century community learning centers, which fund lots of after-school programs, comprehensive literacy development, American Indian education, and 21 other initiatives have all been removed from Title IV. So there's no obligation to spend money on any of those things. And again, as we saw in Los Angeles, for instance, we can spend money on giving every kid a Chromebook when there are really more pressing human needs like restorative justice or social workers or chemistry and physics teachers, right? And that's the danger of this flexibility and lack of set-asides in Title IV. All right, next slide. But that's not all, unfortunately. There are other threats to equity in the budget that I'll just run through really quickly. There's $230 million in an innovation fund that formerly went for research. Now that research has to be about choice, and it's almost like predetermining the outcomes and the conclusions. So research on vouchers and research on charters, and it's going to be available to religious and private schools. There's going to be 167 million for charters, of which 100 million is going to be specifically for facilities. And so this is going to be a permanent set of schools that are funded with federal funds that compete with public schools and could make public schools obsolete, or buildings that need to be remodeled, less likely to be remodeled. Also, there's funds for charter management organizations, and we know that those are the ones that have the tendency to cream off a lot of money and cream off the best students and not be open to all students. So all these are ways of draining from the public coffers to put into private hands. For the Office of Civil Rights, there's not going to be a change in funds, but there are going to be 40 fewer positions that are allocated. So they're going to lose 40 investigators that could potentially look into civil rights violations in school districts. And there's a very modest increase at the the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Justice, which sometimes works with the Department of Education. But we've seen a lot of anti-civil rights signals already from the Department of Justice in terms of guidance around prisons and mandatory minimums. And those are things that can have an impact on juvenile offenders as well. There's more funds for community-oriented policing, a $17.4 million increase that funds many school resource officers, which we know have a history of being really problematic, particularly for kids of color and kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then there's a cut to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There's going to be about $100 million cut, by some estimates, and then even by the most generous estimates, it's still going to be about half the amount that was appropriated to help students with special needs. And then finally, I just wanted to spend a bit of time here on Medicaid. And that's something that we don't normally think about as impacting schools, but it really does, because it pays a portion of the school-based staff like nurses and counselors, paraprofessionals and classroom aides that help students with special needs be mainstreamed, as well as school-based services such as vision and hearing screenings. And so under Medicaid, any child who gets early screening and diagnostic services is paid for by Medicaid. And then if they have any treatment that's deemed necessary, like hearing aids, that has to be provided as well. And if Medicaid is changed in the way that the House proposed, they're going to put a cap on the amount that states get from the federal government. There's going to be less federal money to the states, and it's going to let states eliminate those vision and hearing screenings and assistive devices that we talked about as well. So last slide in this section. Just some questions to ask again as you leave behind. How has your state informed Congress about how these cuts for disadvantaged students and support for teaching are really going to impact your students? How will your state respond to funding cuts for disadvantaged kids and kids with disabilities? Will your state opt in to the portability plan if that's offered? That's an open question, and one that advocates have a great deal of influence over determining whether their state will play a part. And how will your state keep focus on important supports like after school and literacy now that those things have been removed in the set-asides for Title IV? questions about the charter expansion and how that will impact the local district. And then finally, how will your state pay for the lost supports in schools if Medicaid is cut? And that means Medicaid is 57% of any federal money going to states, and that's more than transportation and higher education combined. So states are gonna have to raise taxes or cut other services to make up for those changes if they actually occur. So those are some of the threats to watch out for under the budget. And I will pass it on to Jamie to talk a little bit about vulnerable students.
Thank you, Beth. An honor, I must say, to go after you. And thank you to SHOT for including the Community for Just Schools Fund in this important conversation. So I do just want to put a fine point on the vulnerable populations that Beth referenced at the end of her remarks, and say that one of the opportunities that exists in ESSA, as it has been drafted, is further information sharing that is going to allow for better protections for homeless youth, for youth in foster care, and for youth who are classified as delinquent and or neglected youth. And so what it will be important for stakeholders to know is that not only should states be providing data related to the experiences of these young people, but they should be doing it in ways that include cross-calculated data so that we can really dig deep into understanding something we really haven't been able to see at the state level very clearly in the past, but what are the experiences that these young people are having at the school level, at the local level, and then at the state level, so that we can then use the questions that you see on the screen here to really ensure that the promise of ESSA is fulfilled and that districts are planning appropriately, especially when we see that the needs of these young people are not being met.
Jamie, hold on one second. This is Tanya. I just want to ask, can people just make sure that they're on mute? And Beth, can you make sure you're on mute? Because I'm hearing a little bit of feedback and I want to make sure that people can understand you, Jamie.
Excellent.
Okay, great. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. If we can go to the next slide. So, data transparency. Under No Child Left Behind, I think many of us are aware that it was, as I just referenced, really difficult to kind of understand individual states' accountability systems. But one of the opportunities that has been presented to us with ESSA is that state report cards, which you heard Tanya remind us will be rolled out in December 2018, will now have to explain a lot about accountability systems, including things like their overall student achievement goals, how many students the school must have from a particular subgroup to be included for accountability purposes, the list of indicators that are being used to measure a school's performance and how much weight they're giving to each indicator, how schools are singled out for extra support, and what schools need to do to move off of improvement status. As we mentioned on the last slide, we also have the opportunity again to kind of understand and see data for groups that have not previously been included in data sharing, foster kids and homeless youth and kids connected to the military. We also have an opportunity now to understand the experiences of children who are long-term English language learners. So states and districts are going to have to report the number and percentage of students who've been identified as English language learners and who've attended school in that district for 5 years or more without being reclassified as proficient in English. So again, we're really able to see how the district is serving students and if they're serving them in ways that lead to success. And then again, a new addition through ESSA is that states have to share just how much they're spending per child in each district and in each school, really helping advocates to better highlight disparities that we know have existed forever, but that are sometimes difficult to really define in terms of the economic investment districts are or are not making. There are some other things, but I just want to make a fine point before I move on that one of the most exciting things is that there is, again, this requirement that, and I'm just going to stop for a minute and make sure that folks can hear me clearly. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, I think we can hear you. There's still some feedback, but I think it might be on your end, but I think it's fine. Just keep going.
The cross-tabulation, what do I mean by that? Now, under ESSA, states are going to have to report their data. So that's test scores and participation, school quality indicators, graduation, in ways that can be cross-tabulated. So that means that a parent or a researcher or anybody can really look to see whether a state's improving their outcomes for a group that is defined in any number of different ways. So this was a big win for the civil rights community, and one that has a lot of promise for what we can learn, even though we won't necessarily see as robust enforcement at the federal level. We're now going to be able to transfer some of that responsibility to the state level. And then I don't want to move on without pointing out the yellow highlight on the screen, just to say you've heard several of us mention the new opportunities within ESSA around teacher qualifications. And in particular, under No Child Left Behind, the requirement was that teachers be highly qualified. But under ESSA, that terminology has been removed. And instead of highly qualified, each state is going to have to determine its own qualification standards for its teachers. And so I just want to make the direct connection for all of us back to the opportunities that exist to do advocacy to ensure states use Title II dollars well, and that we recognize the opportunity to ensure that young people of color are being served by teachers that look like them, that those investments, that there's an opportunity to lift them up and to ensure states are making the choices that we would want them to make. Next slide. And again, in the spirit of transparency and ensuring that data is easily accessible to communities, these are some of the things that will be required for states to share more directly, that come straight out of what the current civil rights data collection reporting requirements are. And so what I want to point out to you here is that not only will state and district report cards need to share disaggregated data around young people's discipline experiences in school, school quality indicators, and safety and climate, but also they will have to share the number and percentage of students enrolled in preschool programs, as well as what we can think of as the equity indicators of a school. And that's who is being able to access accelerated coursework, what accelerated coursework is available in an individual school, and what of those accelerated coursework options are leading to post-secondary credits for students in high school. Next slide. And so I'm here with you today as a representative of the Communities for Just Schools Fund. We are a donor collaborative with an explicit racial equity lens. We're made up of 14 foundations that support community organizers who are mobilizing and advocating for equity in their schools. Our work started as a way to address and eliminate the school to prison pipeline. And we've always, as a fund, been focused on the kind of interwoven network of factors like exclusionary discipline, law enforcement referrals, school-based arrests. And what we have seen through the work of our partners is that children are confronting structural failures that contribute to their stress, that negatively impact their academic achievement. And far too often, these children are low-income children of color. So we have the opportunity to support at the Communities for Just Schools Fund the people who are leading us out of this vicious cycle for which ESSA presents an opportunity. And who are those people? They are community organizers. And these community organizers are helping really to ask critical questions. What is it about systems that is empowering adults to behave in unhelpful ways and harmful ways with only certain children. Who are these children? What are the schools that they want? And I want to pause and connect that to the information that I just shared and the promise that ESSA provides in that context. And so from the network of CJSF, Communities for Just Schools Fund partners, which is 50 partners strong, working across 19 states in the United States, what we have been able to do is to draw upon the work that they were doing before the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, changing discipline codes around the country, advocating to remove police from schools, focusing on redirecting federal resources from police to school wellness, and being explicit about the need to have a racial equity lens, focusing on lifting up the importance of racial justice and what that means in a school context, culturally relevant pedagogy, and so many other things. So this moment in which we're focused on ESSA is a moment in which our partners have really kind of turned the page from chapter 1 of the work around school discipline reform, which was really what not to do, to the first page of chapter 2, which is what do we want to do? We want to create healthy school climate and best practices. And so from the Communities for Just Schools Fund's lens, that is what we've been doing with our CJSF ESSA grassroots initiative. That, in conjunction with our soon-to-be launched Best Practices Institute, which will be a way in which technical and assistance and implementation with youth and families is a priority to address the fact that we understand from our partners that districts often don't know where to start in reform efforts. They need youth voice and family voice, but they don't know how to access it in legitimate and authentic ways always. So we're supporting that through both our Best Practices Institute and the ESSA Grassroots Initiative. And the point I want to make with this slide before we move along is that we have supported a number of partners that are doing work in local places. And Marilyn Young, who will speak after me, is one of those amazing partners, and we're grateful that she's on today. But in addition to supporting local partners, we've also invested in resourcing 2 major national organizations, the Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national coalition of groups that are agitating also against the school to prison pipeline, investing resources in the collaborative processes that are leading to campaigns like Counselors Not Cops and so much more, and also the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And what those 2 organizations have been able to do in support of local partners is all kinds of things. They have created a network of federal liaisons who have worked with them to write letters to their state departments, lifting up collaboratively developed recommendations for what should be in a state's plan. They have created new tools for states to use that are grounded in the perspectives and experiences of youth and parents. A checklist for state plans, a sample report card for a state to reference that really emphasizes the importance of positive school climate. They've done proactive outreach to the states that haven't yet submitted their plans, and they've done that by looking at the work of states that have already submitted their plans and drawing the conclusions around what we see from a parent and youth perspective as both the good and the bad of those plans to date. And then the last thing I'll mention as an example of their efforts is that they've liaised with groups like the Council of Chief State School Officers, which from a much more grass tops level is working to create an ESSA guidebook. And so they've been able to partner with them to ensure that their planning and thinking involves the perspectives of the most disenfranchised parents and youth in our communities, in our country. Next slide. And so I just want to give you a quick sample of where the local partners are doing this work in partnership with us. And it's really wonderful to be able to say in partnership with organizations like the Schott Foundation as well. This has truly been a collective effort. So you'll see here that we're invested heavily in the Mississippi Delta. And again, Marilyn Young's going to talk about this work, so I won't go into too much detail. But just to say that the beauty of the approach we're taking in Mississippi is that the groups that you see listed on this screen have been doing work that is directly in response to the need to address the overt racism that permeates the Mississippi's policies, practices, and approach to education, and has for years and years. Southern Echo, which is one of our lead partners, has served as kind of a hub through which intergenerational community organizing has focused on the need to improve education. And they've done that in partnership with their State Department of Education. That's been a very close working relationship. And they've been able to do things like revising student handbooks, focusing on positive school climate indicators, and seeking to support the implementation of the P16 councils, which are a state level designation of community groups that are supposed to be working in partnership with systems actors to improve education, but unfortunately we understand all too often haven't been able to do that because of a lack of resources. And then the next slide. And then the last set of groups that I want to point out to you is, in addition to the investments that we've made in Mississippi, in the Delta, we've also invested in groups working in Dayton, Ohio, and across the state of Ohio, as well as in Boston, Massachusetts, and throughout Massachusetts. And the 2 points, I'll make a couple of points about each, and then I'll wrap up. Just to say that, for instance, in the example of Racial Justice Now, this is a parent-led organization. It's the only parent advocacy organization in Ohio that represents the interests of low to moderate income parents of color. This is a relatively new organization that has gotten off to an amazing start. And what they've been able to do is build off the work that they did to do a state level report card, which really assigns a grade to school districts, to charter schools, and to vocational schools throughout Ohio based on a number of things, including academic outcomes, but also school discipline indicators and other such things. And we can share a link to that and to their more recent report card. But they've been able to use that as a way to demand that the state of Ohio listen to the voices of parents and youth in their planning process, that they get beyond the unintentional or intentional obstacles the state has put up, like not planning meetings at times that are accessible to parents who work 1 or 2 jobs or who can't take time off during the day. So Racial Justice Now has been able to do some of those super important, seemingly simple, but if nobody's focused on them, intractable, addressing intractable issues that can lead to a lack of parent and youth representation. And then Youth on Board has been our partner in Massachusetts. They have an interesting model. They're doing youth and student organizing. And again, this is a partnership that we know that SHOT is invested in as well, and we're grateful for that. They, one of the things I'd like to note about them is that for several years, they have been co-administering with Boston Public Schools an advisory council that is a citywide group of students who advocate around educational policies and issues. And they've been able to use those relationships to revise their code of conduct in Boston, to change Massachusetts regulations to actually focus more intentionally on positive school climate creation, and to actually start modeling in schools the use of restorative justice that's youth-led. And they do a lot of this because they do political education for their young people around knowing their rights. And so one of the fun things that they've done that they hope to share with others is creating an application, the Boston Students' Rights app. It's available at bostonstudentrights.org. And it's an actual app that young people and parents can go into to understand when they have an experience in school that just doesn't seem right, what exactly are their rights? And all of these things have positioned them well to try to influence ESSA, and we've been delighted to partner with them. The last thing I will say before moving to the next slide is that we all know school climate and safety is an optional accountability indicator that state plan design teams can choose. We also know that it's going to take local advocates being at the table to exert the pressure to ensure school climate as an indicator. This has been very, very difficult to deliver upon. And the people who are best positioned to do that are not the grass tops groups. They really are the locally grounded, culturally aware communities who are experiencing the schools as family members and youth every single day. And so again, we're excited to know that this webinar is being made available to folks as a resource so that we understand, as we seek to get report cards in place in each state, that focus on the accountability that's going to move us forward, we also have to remember to focus on the accountability of creating a seat at the table for youth and parents, not only in the planning process, but as we move forward. And with that, the last slide, please. So you'll see here, again, some questions that we put together to serve as a useful framework to you and thinking about how do you seek to determine if those things that I've just mentioned are actually happening. And the one I want to just pull out for you here is that fourth question. Does the report card design take into account feedback provided through the required parental and stakeholder consultation? So I would just point out here again that this is where our groups are working to ensure that parents and youth are genuinely represented, not only in the planning, but as we move forward. And so I'm grateful to everyone who's taken the time to learn alongside with us today and looking forward to the work ahead. With that, I'm going to have the privilege to hand it over to Marilyn Young, who's joining us from Southern Echo and Tanika Teens in Action, and is going to take it down to what's actually happening and what we can learn from that. Marilyn?
So thank you very much, Jamie. Hello to each and every one of you. As Jamie shared with you, my name is Marilyn Young, and I'm from Southern Echo. And I also work with a coalition of 10 other organizations throughout the Mississippi Delta called the Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable. And we focus in the Delta because that is one of our areas where our children are the most vulnerable and very, very badly resourced. And so as a part of the stakeholders engagement piece that I'll be talking about, I will start by saying that it is very important for us to ensure that we are actively engaged in this process and that our voices be heard and lifted up as a part of it. And so Mississippi just approved the state plan last week. We have had an opportunity to be a very integral part of that process. As Jamie was sharing with you, we were intentional and deliberate about building a relationship with Dr. Wright, Dr. Oakley, and Dr. Wright is our state superintendent of education. And we've been working with her over the last probably 10 to 15 years. She wasn't always there in that process, but we've been called on by Mississippi Department of Education to help in a number of different projects. And so as a result of that, it wasn't very difficult for us to get to the table. But if we had not been at the table, we would have figured out some way to be able to get there. And I'll start by saying, you know, we are very, very much in tune to making sure that we have parent engagement. And we define parent engagement as parentals, family, and community engagement is an ongoing process. We like to know that we have to constantly increase participation, communication, and collaboration between our parents, families, and schools to make sure that we get that holistic of education approach that we seek. We had an opportunity. Mississippi has what is called a Educators Equity Lab. And Mississippi has there are 10 focus schools that are inside of the Mississippi Delta. Most of them are inside of the Mississippi Delta. And they received this designation from the U.S. Department of Education simply because it has the highest achievement gap inside of the state of Mississippi. And so when we looked at some of that data, we knew that we had to be on the ground and talking to MDE because a lot of times it's just looked over. The Mississippi Delta is just looked over. And we've been receiving so many cuts from the state level. We knew that ESSA was one of the ways that we could certainly impact it and get more resources into that area. And so the Mississippi Department of Education created what they call an advisory board. And that advisory board was comprised of about 30 members. It was a mixture of elected officials, state employees, community-based organization, advocacy groups, public education, disability groups, as well as the NAACP and others that are working on education issues. And we have been meeting over the course of the last year to make sure that we can have input inside of those meetings. Our recommendations so far, a lot of them have been taken. However, we have to see what the end product is going to be, because we do know that this plan, even though it was just approved, has to have some oversight. When it gets to the APA, the review process, which it is going out to the public now, there's also a provision where the governor gets to see and say what he wants inside of this plan based on the way it's being done inside of Mississippi. And so we've attended almost every advisory committee meeting. They also have what is called a working group meeting, and the working group meetings, that's where they usually vet a lot of the input that they've collected. Mississippi started last year with what they call listening tours, and they held 15 listening tours all over the state of Mississippi, with the exception that there wasn't one in the Delta close enough to where we thought it should be. So we made the request, and they did honor the request to bring it inside of the Delta. But inside of those listening tours, we made a point to be at every one of them to make sure that we put all the information that we thought needed to be inside that process. And one of the things, as Jamie talked about, was that Mississippi did not use school climate as one of its indicators. And so we thought we have to make sure that that climate is lifted up, no matter whether they decided to put it in there or not. And so we did reach out. We are members of the Dignity in School Network. We do receive technical assistance from LDF as a part of that. So we put together a letter, as she said, that we submitted to the Mississippi Department of Education to ensure and make sure those things that we wanted around school climate was indeed included in there. And I'll talk just about a little bit of what we put inside of that letter. The first thing we asked to include school climate and safety in the state's accountability system, and to measure the indicators by using surveys of school discipline and chronic absenteeism. We wanted to make certain that the absenteeism was not just on students, but certainly teachers and administrators, because we find that a lot of times some of the children are not the problem. We have a teacher problem where if teachers are not there at school, how can the children really get the quality education that's supposed to be delivered to them? And how can they ensure that the curriculum is being followed and that the children will be able to pass those standardized tests at the end of the year that they're holding them accountable for, parents, the community, and the school as a whole? We ask that they ensure the accountability for the success of every subgroup of students, including our LGBT community, our gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer students, because we know that inside of Mississippi, it's like a taboo. Those are things we just don't talk about, but we want to make sure we uplift that because we do not want our children to be excluded from this process, no matter what their gender is. The third thing was we wanted to ensure students involved in the juvenile justice system had some type of transition back into the regular system, and to ensure that those children were not being punished again. Because oftentimes what we saw that if a child did something and went into the criminal justice system, when they came back, they were usually bundled to the alternative school process. They stayed there for a extended period of time, or even would be suspended again for very minor infraction because they just simply didn't want to deal with the child. And that was another way to cleverly get rid of them. And so we made sure we lift that up and let them know that those things are definitely on our radar, and we will be looking and monitoring for that. The next thing was encourage school districts and schools to identify improvements to include strategies for addressing teacher shortage, teacher quality, and racial disparities in discipline. And as we went through the listening tours, we talked in depth with them about how are they going to fix the teacher shortage problem inside of the Mississippi Delta. We don't want you to just tell us, a lip service, because that's a huge problem. And in 1998, Mississippi, the state passed a law of the Mississippi teacher shortage, critical teacher shortage area. And the Mississippi Delta is pretty much the hub where we have a lot of teachers that are not highly qualified, highly certified, and caring. And that was language that we added to it, because you can get a highly qualified, highly certified teacher, but if they don't care about children, you still end up with bad results. So we also asked them to look at another alternative way to figure out how we could get every teacher assistant inside of our school system certified as teachers. Here in Mississippi, K through 3, almost every teacher inside of there has a teacher assistant. And if you want to double the number, the size of teachers, that's one way we saw as a quick way to help get rid of the teacher shortage problem. Because for the most part, the teachers assistants live in our communities. They're there for extended periods of time. They're not going anywhere. We need to figure out how to utilize them in a more effective way. That's a good way we thought would be able to really boost our teacher shortage, critical teacher shortage piece. The other thing we talked in great detail with them about is we have to figure out how to tie economic development and housing inside of this ESSA plan. Now, we know that some of those things were very, very robust, but we were clear in order for us to recruit and retain teachers, they need somewhere to stay. And if you don't have affordable housing in a lot of these areas inside of the Mississippi Delta, most of those teachers are going to leave and go on to another area where they can find the affordable housing and other areas of economic in terms of grocery stores, Walmart, and other things that they, want to have access to. And so we raised those things in all of those listening tours and made sure that, every time we were there, we constantly reiterated those things as a part of that process. We asked them to support schools and districts identifying as improvement and targeted fundings. We know that currently there's inside of Mississippi, we have 144 school districts, a total of 902 schools. And so at the state board meeting on last Friday, we found out that out of those 902 schools, there are 144 schools already on the list as targeted schools that need improvement. So when the State Department looked at the set aside for the 5% of the federal government for those schools, it came out to be roughly around $500,000. And they were clear that's only enough to probably serve about 20 of those schools. And so one of the state board members kind of pushed back and said, so if we only have enough resources to help 20 schools out of 144, what would that do for the most vulnerable children inside of these other schools? Because they don't have the ability locally to generate revenue because they don't have the economics data to create the millage rate to do that. And so that is something we certainly are very concerned about, and we're going to have to raise those issues in this APA process, because we know going in that Mississippi is already on the shafting list in terms of resources to be able to really work with those vulnerable children inside of our schools. And the last thing, we wanted to make sure that they provided parents and families with a comprehensive information that provided a real picture of the school. And Jamie alluded to that report card. We've had one in the past. There were a lot of things that were not included, like the teaching absenteeism. We wanted to make sure that we asked that certain things be lifted up and put inside of that. And it's a whole list that we went through as a part of that process. And so the state plan will give us another opportunity in terms of in this public comment process. There's a very short window for it. I think it's a 30-day period. And so it went out for APA after they approved it. And then in July, we will have an opportunity to write in for some of those things. And so as a part of that process, one of the things we certainly have been lifting up inside of this, the P16 Community Engagement Council that Jamie alluded to. And what that is the P16 Community Engagement Council. It's a pre-K through college. That's where the 16 comes in. We started at pre-K, and we wanted to be able to have a picture to take children all the way through the first 4 years of college, to have a broad and diverse community-based, community-led process where you had actually stakeholders that were not just only inside of the school district, but you wanted to make sure that it had a wide range of people from the entire community. And so the State Department, when they did this, it derived out of the Children First Act of 2009. The state passed that law in 2009. And as a part of that, if you were a school improvement for 2 consecutive years, you had to come up with and create a P16 council. And that cross section of the community council was to be able to help advise and guide the local school board and the local district about what the needs were from the community perspective, and how could they partner to move the school district in the right direction. And so the State Department called on Southern Echo because they said they really didn't know how to engage parents and communities on the grassroots level because they were more of an academic process. And so Southern Echo spent, and the Mississippi Delta Catholic Roundtable spent about a year and a half coming up with a manual to do that, so we could have something to teach communities how the process would go, what were the underlying values, what was our thinking as we put the process together. And one of the things we did was we kind of looked at how could we make sure all voices were at the table. And so we created 6 categories for where we would get the council members from. And the councils would come from community-based organizations that's working on education issues. We wanted to make sure that the PTO or the PTA, whichever one was in existence, would be a part and had representation at the table. We wanted to make sure that there were students on the council. And we told them we needed students to at least be start the age around 12, because we wanted to make sure that the middle school had representation, because that's where the puberty and everything starts. And we wanted to make sure that their voices were heard, because oftentimes when these decisions are being made, what we think are important to students at that age is not always important to them. And I'll use an example. We did a survey and we were talking to them about what are some of the things that you thought a student should be suspended for. And we were thinking more along the line if they fight or if they brought a weapon and thing. And the students' answer to that was no. The worst thing a person could do to us that we think a child should be suspended for is them taking other people's property. They felt like if you stole something of theirs, they wanted you to be crucified. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a far fetch from the way we traditionally think about from the academic side, but from the students' perspective, it was totally different. And so we definitely wanted to make sure that students were at the table and that they were able to, voices were uplifted, and we took those recommendations from them. We also made sure that the clergy
Marilyn,
organization. Yes.
hey, so I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for some questions. So if you're able to go ahead and finish that up, because I know that we've only got about 10 more minutes, and I know that people have a lot of questions about what you're talking about and everybody else.
Okay. And so that Community Engagement Council, we have a process. We do have a manual that we created to make sure we could walk communities through it. And the end goal for that is for that community-based community-based P16 council to create a comprehensive plan. And we looked at taking that plan out 5-10 years down the road. What would you want your school to look like? What were some of the things you thought were very important as a part of that process? And so we have that manual. We have done training all over the state of Mississippi. We have just been called back to Mississippi Department of Education to sit at the table, because one of the things we're asking MDE to include this as part of the ESSA requirement. All school districts should have a P16 Community Engagement Council. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for that wonderful presentation about really how you all have been engaged in this process, and some of the particulars that maybe many may not have considered that relate to ensuring that students' input is considered in this process. So I wanted to just kind of briefly go ahead and move to an opportunity for people to provide some ask questions. We had a few more things that we were going to talk about, but what I think I'm going to do is just identify what those questions are. We had kind of mentioned earlier that there are things beyond ESSA and the accountability plans that go to ensuring making sure that we're achieving equity. That includes looking at how your charter school process, and so there's some questions here that you can take a look at later, as well as understanding how you're going to provide a diverse classroom as well as a diverse workforce. And then lastly, understanding how it is you're going to provide for wraparound services and supports. And so again, these are leave behinds that I hope that you all will be able to take a look at the end of this presentation and later on at your discretion. And then lastly, these are just kind of a final compilation of questions for you to consider if your state has already submitted a plan or whether if your state is about to submit a plan in September. So let me stop here and hand it over to Mariana to see if there's any questions that we can answer before we end the webinar today.
Sure. So we have some questions coming in that were just great, and we can try to cover as many as we can and continue the conversation perhaps over Twitter. So this question is that the U.S. Department of Education was critical of most of the 17 plans that were submitted. Have any of the state plans been approved? So Tanya, you may know this.
I'm sorry, so the question is just whether the state plans have been approved?
That's correct.
Okay, yes, they have all been approved. So there were 17 plans that were submitted, and that was the list that I provided earlier. All of those have been approved already, and so we're still waiting for the additional plans to be submitted for that are due in September.
Great. And what concerns do you have with the administration's new requests to review burdensome regulations? Will this impact civil rights regulations?
So I welcome my other presenters to also chime in on that. I'm sure they'll have much to say. I will briefly say yes, it is a concern. In fact, as I noticed that request coming out yesterday, either yesterday or the day before, it kind of sent shivers through my spine because I understand what that means. And essentially it does create an opportunity for there to be a rollback on some of the necessary oversight and guidance that we had created and really fully implemented when we were at the department during the Obama administration. So yes, there are opportunities to roll back civil rights, and I think that is why it's extremely important for everyone on the call to provide their comments and to provide comments that know there is provide their concerns about any types of rollbacks of regs that will support the necessary oversight of all of our students and accountability provisions for our students in the classroom. So I'll stop there and see if there's any other commentary.
Just one of the things to be cognizant of is, as Jamie mentioned, the data reporting requirements that used to be part of the civil rights data collection has now been kind of moved into ESSA and is supposed to be reported in those state report cards. So that's one of the areas that's most vulnerable to states and districts making the case that, oh, this is a burdensome regulation, we shouldn't have to do it, it takes too much time to cross-tabulate, all those excuses that you might hear. But a way to respond to that is to say, well, you're gonna have to submit these things under ESSA anyway when ESSA becomes fully implemented. So you might as well go ahead and continue the habit that they've been in since the 60s in actually participating in the civil rights data collection and go ahead and incorporate it in the public accountability process that ESSA requires.
Great, so this next question is actually for you, Beth. You talked about the equity assessment requirement being probably one of the most underdeveloped parts of this. Can you speak to any resources around that that could offer states with support?
I am director of the Education Justice Network, and we've been working with the Journey for Justice Alliance, which is one of the SHOT Foundation grantees, and are involved with Dignity in Schools as well. And we are in the process of developing some exemplars in 8 or 10 cities across the country of how those equity assessments could be implemented by community-based organizations. We have some materials that we've been using for this campaign just to sensitize people to what they are and what they mean. And so if people got in contact with me through SHOT and through Mariana, I can share some of those materials with you as well.
Great, so I see that we are at a minute mark, and so at this time, I just really want to thank and appreciate you all. Tanya, Beth, Jamie, Marilyn, it's so wonderful to be in partnership with you and to be in community with you all today. And so as Beth mentioned, we will be sharing links to resources for this webinar including this presentation and Education Justice Network's ESSA Toolkit. It will be on the SHOT website, where you can also join SHOT's National Opportunity to Learn Network at shotfoundation.org. And also follow us on Twitter to get updates on future webinars, as well as connect with a growing network of education justice advocates. We need it now more than ever. There were a lot of questions around how can we organize together and organize better. So that's one way. And just thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.